Last week I said that New Zealand was a quasi-police state. Sadly, this week it has become one. We have seen the passage of an egregious and shabby piece of legislation that has allowed warrantless searches and unprecedented spying and control of us all. In this episode, I explain how we slipped from a vibrant democracy to a petty dictatorship with a failed economy. It all started with a clever manipulation, then an illegal lockdown, the development of a snitch culture, and an empowered police force. And we all prostrated ourselves before the Prime Minister and thanked her for saving us all ever so much. This is Insight Politics, and I'm Cam Slater. I've been looking at the psychology of communication, how messages are presented and interpreted, particularly with regards to the Chinese virus crisis. Effective communication is a connection between people that allows for the exchange of thoughts, feelings, and ideas, and that leads to mutual understanding. This exchange is evidenced when a speaker sends a message to which a listener or a viewer responds. It seems simple, but it isn't. People tend to take the communication process for granted. We generally figure that the communication between two or more people is no big deal, it just works. Jacinda Ardern has an often mocked degree in communications from Waikato University, and it really helped her take advantage of this crisis. Every message consists of content and feeling. The content is what the message is about, based on the words used. The feeling, connected to the content, is expressed through non-verbal cues. Body language, gestures, facial expression, tone of voice, inflection, and voice volume. Jacinda Ardern is very, very good making the words match what her body is saying. Despite her lazy diction and poor elocution, she still manages to get the message across. Whenever there are discrepancies between a message's content and feeling, confusion is created for the listener, especially if the content and feeling seem to contradict each other. This is Simon Bridges' problem. He's a poor communicator. His words do not match his body language or his intonation. It sounds and looks insincere and inauthentic. That is because it is. He's a fake. But so too is Ardern. But she's better at faking it, so she makes it while Bridges doesn't. All news sells, but bad news sells best. The virus crisis has lots of bad news for canny politicians to milk. The saying in the media is, if it bleeds, it leads. And so with regard to the pandemic, Ardern sold us the really, really bad news. And then she told us that she was going to save us all from it. She scared everyone so that we'd all be thankful. It was a clever manipulation. Here's how she did it. Initially, she was telling us that everything was fine. She thought everything was good because the Ministry of Health said on the 24th of January that the risk of catching the Chinese virus was very low. Look it up, I did. That's exactly what they said. On the 25th of February, she made a state visit to Fiji, flying the Air Force 757 up there. And then she went on to Australia so she could insult Scott Morrison, complete with the backdrop of the Opera House as she stood at Kirribilli House. But Italy was already in lockdown. People were already dying outside of China, and our Prime Minister was gallivanting about the Pacific. But then something changed, and so did the messaging. Ardern had to frighten us in order to get us to meekly comply with what we now know was an illegal lockdown. So out came the frighteners. She started claiming that tens of thousands would die.
If community transmission takes off in New Zealand, the number of cases will double every 5 days. If that happens unchecked, our health system will be inundated, and tens of thousands of New Zealanders will die.
Note that she said that tens of thousands will die. This is just 3 days after stating that rumours of a lockdown were false, and she is announcing that contrary to her earlier assertions, that they were now going to lock us all down. So she frightened us. What did she use to make this claim? Well, 3 reports, 2 from the University of Otago and 1 from a professor of physics, one Sean Hendy. You may remember this tool. He was the one who used buses and trains for a year to travel the country instead of flying. Apparently, it was going to save us from climate change. But here is the kicker. Every single one of those models was based on the now thoroughly discredited models of the most wrong predictor of pandemic death tolls in the world, Neil Ferguson from Imperial College. Most Western countries used that flawed model, and it's been described as worse than SimCity but without the cute graphics. A flawed model that produced more flawed models, all of which said that 80,000 people would die from the Chinese virus in New Zealand. Big scary numbers. Big scary numbers well communicated by someone skilled at fooling everyone. 80,000 people will die. Unless you do what we say, of course. And fool you she did. Everyone complied because you were scared into it. It was a cynical and clever manipulation, and we all fell for it. You don't hear much now from Neil Ferguson. The useful idiot has served his purpose, but the reports and the models the Prime Minister used still stand. They shouldn't. They are all inconvenient lies that hoodwinked a country. She knowingly and cynically used Ferguson and Hendry and Susie Wiles, and they aren't convenient anymore. Once we were frightened into compliance, the hard part was done. The next 6 weeks simply cemented into everyone's minds the next step of the messaging and brainwashing, that we went hard and that we went early. And therefore Jacinda Ardern saved us all from the scary virus. We complied, they illegally locked us down, and every other voice was shut down, and the media never questioned it at all. Such was the strength of the propaganda. The big lie is a propaganda technique, famously explained by Joseph Goebbels when he said, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." Now most people stop the quote there, but what Goebbels said next explains precisely what happened over 8 weeks in New Zealand. He said, "The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state." Now that you can see it, you can see the big lie. And the next big lie was that we went hard and we went early. But did we? Well, no. I prepared a timeline to find out if we really did go hard and early. It turns out we didn't do either. As I mentioned earlier, on the 24th of January, both the Ministry of Health and Jacinda Ardern said that the risk of catching the Chinese virus was very low. On the 27th of January, Ministry of Health staff started meeting travellers from China. Were there any tests? No. Were any put in quarantine? No. So what were these health wallers doing? Well, they were handing out pamphlets, and I dare say most of those ended up in the bins 30 metres further down the concourse. On January 31st, Donald Trump banned all foreign nationals who had travelled in mainland China within 14 days from entering the United States. What did we do? Nothing is what. All our media joined in with the Democrats in calling Trump a racist. Yet 3 days later, on the 2nd of February, New Zealand joined the United States and Australia in banning foreign nationals who had travelled through China. But it was called a temporary ban. Anyone else was free to enter. Importantly, there were still 3 flights a day landing at Auckland Airport from China. WHO had declared the Chinese virus was a public health emergency of international concern, and on the 2nd of February people started dying outside of China. And on the 8th of February, 2 Kiwis aboard the Diamond Princess came down with the virus as the cruise industry began to get hit. And on the 17th of February, the first person outside of Asia died in France. On the 19th, Iran's first patient was notified, and by February 22, Italy had quarantined 50,000 people in Lombardy. But despite all of that, on the 25th of February, Ardern made a state visit to Fiji, flying the Air Force 757 up there, and then she went on to Australia so she could insult Scott Morrison, complete with the backdrop of the Opera House as she stood at Kirribilli House. All good, nothing to see here. Slim chance of catching the virus was the official message. But Italy was already in lockdown. People were already dying outside of China, and our Prime Minister was gallivanting about the Pacific. 3 days later, we had our first case, and it was still February. Like most cases to come, this case was from someone with international travel, and in this case, from Iran. It was only after this case was notified were visitors arriving from Iran banned. Everyone else could sail through the border. But the proverbial horse had already bolted through the barely secured barn door. On February the 28th, the Ministry of Health staff began meeting direct flights landing at New Zealand airports from Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Singapore and Thailand. They were still only giving out pamphlets. Still no testing, still no quarantine requirements. And the general public, though, started to react, flooding shops and stripping shelves bare. But the government was still saying there was nothing to see here. On March the 1st, the first death in Australia occurred. Our borders with Australia were still wide open. On March the 2nd, someone presented a petition to Parliament demanding the borders be closed. It was ignored, but 2 days later Jacinda Ardern stated at a press conference that the chances of catching the Wu flu from asymptomatic people was very, very low. We had little to no testing at this stage, and neither did the world, so it was impossible for her to even make that claim, yet make it she did. In other words, don't panic. Just like Corporal Jones used to say from Dad's Army. Still not hard, and certainly not early. For the next 4 days, we had a new case every day. On March the 6th, the Ministry of Health presented a report recommending we close the borders and quarantine arrival. It was ignored. The government instead opted for a second option, asking travellers to self-isolate. They were relying on trust. It certainly wasn't hard nor early. And on March the 8th, Italy locked down 16 million people. March the 11th, WHO finally declared a global pandemic. March the 13th saw Donald Trump ban travel from Europe. Our borders were still wide open. No quarantine, no testing, just pamphlets and some self-isolation requests. That was the same day that Auckland Council shut down Pacifica, and the same day the Prime Minister said that Christchurch commemorations would still go ahead on March 15. We had, by this time, 5 days with no new cases. A strange silence in reporting that still shows up on the charts as a large flat line. But the next day all hell would break loose. The Christchurch City Council cancelled Ardern's Hugfest. The 6th case was also notified, and the government implemented the second option, asking for all who entered the country to self-isolate. Cruise ships were told to sling their hooks. But what did self-isolation entail? Certainly not a government-supervised quarantine. It was simply a promise from the traveller that they would self-isolate. On March 15, the Ruby Princess cluster in Napier began, so the cruise ship ban was late and soft rather than hard and early. We had 2 new cases that day. The words the Prime Minister used now changed, and she first used the words hard and early. If only it were true. Our borders were still open and there were no quarantines in place. On March 16, Ardern got stroppy as the forlorn hope that visitors would self-isolate was obvious to even blind Freddie. She declared that any foreigners who refused to self-isolate would be deported. It didn't matter that she lacked the legal framework to say that. She just said it anyway. St. Patrick's Day saw the start of another cluster in Matamata. All cases are people who have travelled overseas. How could they have brought this back if we went hard and early? On March 19, nearly another month after her trip around the Pacific, Ardern finally closed the borders to all foreign nationals. And then on March 19, as people were ransacking supermarkets and preparing for lockdown, the Prime Minister made a public statement that rumour of a lockdown was fake news. Have a listen.
I've been watching for some days, and this is not unique to New Zealand, that in the midst of what is a global issue, as you would expect, there are a number of rumours that circulate. I am present on social media, I see it myself. I cannot go around and individually dismiss every single rumour I see on social media, as tempted as I might be. So instead I want to send a clear message to the New Zealand public. We will share with you the most up-to-date information daily. You can trust us as a source of that information. You can also trust the Director General of Health and the Ministry of Health. For that information, do feel free to visit at any time to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth.
There you have it. Ardern declared that the government and her were the single source of truth. No one else, just them. Not media, just Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield. Trust us, we tell the truth. There's no lockdown planned. Except they were lying. Because just 2 days later, the Prime Minister interrupted television broadcasts, purloined the airwaves, and told us all that there was a new 4-level alert system and that we were now at a level 2. She told us tens of thousands will die.
If community transmission takes off in New Zealand, the number of cases will double every 5 days. If that happens unchecked, our health system will be inundated, and tens of thousands of New Zealanders will die.
She asked that older folks stay at home, asked that non-essential travel cease, and to get ready for an escalation. She frightened everyone into complying by stating that tens of thousands will die. She also told us that because she had a plan, we'd be saved, and we had to do as we were told. Hard and early was used often. 2 days later, total cases passed 100, and just 2 days after level 2, we were now at level 3. With a promise to go to full alert level 4 in 48 hours. A state of emergency was declared 1 month to the day since Ardern was gallivanting around the Pacific, and the next day we were in lockdown. But it wasn't until April 9 that we had full border control with strict quarantine, which was also illegal. Hard and early was nothing but a slogan, from someone who's cynically exploiting fear in order to illegally control the population. Her slogans were effective, whilst at the same time being a lie. We didn't go hard, nor did we go early. But what was to come next was far more sinister, as New Zealand slipped into totalitarianism in the space of a few short weeks. Well done, New Zealand. We're now in a police state. And let me explain how we got there. Firstly, the government had to decide that they wanted to control us. Then they had to decide how they were going to do it. They came to the decision to control us rather slowly, as I've just outlined. That happened sometime in March. But once that happened, we were delivered a world-class display of propaganda that would have made Joseph Goebbels blush. They told the big lie and convinced us that we were going to die unless we did as we were told. The lie was so big and so scary that it worked. New Zealand was locked down, and the police, despite a legal opinion from Crown Law that said the lockdown was illegal, aided and abetted the government. They knew on March 28, just 3 days after the lockdown began, that the actions of the government were illegal. They had a decision to make. They could uphold the rule of law and tell the government they couldn't do what was asked of them, or they could tug their forelocks and do the bidding of their political masters. They chose the latter. And at that point, just 3 days into the lockdown, New Zealand became an illegal police state. Essentially, the government had performed a coup, and the majority of the public got on their knees and praised Jacinda Ardern for saving them. Kiwis surrendered their hard-won freedoms in a matter of days out of fear, based on a big lie that tens of thousands will die. And meekly, we complied. Now comes the really sinister part. Any good police state requires a bunch of brown shirts. And we had that bunch of brown shirts, except they wore blue and had police written on their cars. To make the brown shirts more effective, though, you need to turn citizens against each other. And that is precisely what the Prime Minister and her police, now comfortable in their new jackboots, did. They established a snitch line. They promoted it. And the Prime Minister, who perhaps now should have the title Chancellor or maybe Gauleiter, even encouraged the media to snitch on businesses. There she was, demanding the details of stroppy business owners bucking her illegal edicts. The snitch line was inundated, as Kiwis turned their backs on a lifetime of loathing snitches and joyfully turned on their fellow citizens who dared to enjoy freedom or wanting to make a living. The media gleefully reported on the jackbooted police shutting down businesses. They too are now part of the arms of the state, good little propagandists that they are. The next step goes further. Like the Nazis in Germany and Austria, the state now wants to know where you are going and who you are seeing. And the shopkeepers of New Zealand are complying, recording names and addresses and cell phone numbers. At the same time, realising that they were rumbled as to the illegality of lockdown, and despite the assurances of our new Reich Attorney General, the Heinrich Himmler of the Labour Party, David Parker, that everything was pretty legal and there were no gaps in the law, they rushed legislation through Parliament in a bit over 24 hours to legalise that which was illegal. They gave their new Reich police with the shiny new jackboots the ability to kick in any door in the land without having to trifle with a warrant. And the transformation from a good little democracy to a fully fledged police state with supernumerary powers was almost complete. And the vast majority of people thanked the blessed Jacinda, who must now surely be close to being beatified. All our freedoms gone, all now controlled by a Politburo and enforced by police with more powers than they'd ever had before, and assisted by a citizen army of snitches. It sounds melodramatic, but that is what has happened. We were let down by police, let down by each other, and our opposition said they tried to help them do it, but they were rejected. Well, that just makes it all right then. What's next? Well, if history serves us well in knowing what happened before, then we are but a very short step from having to sew yellow markers on our clothes. And that is precisely what is going to happen, except they'll call it an app, and the dopey and stunned citizenry will comply with that too. Do you trust the government to not use that power against you once they work out how bloody convenient it is for monitoring you all? Not bloody likely. Do you trust the police to relinquish their newfound powers once this virus is sorted? Not bloody likely. And do you trust Gauleiter Ardern to give us back our freedoms that we once had without a single bit of the new powers retained, just in case, for our own good? Again, not bloody likely. And where were those soldiers of the left who bravely fought the excesses of the John Key government and their extended spying powers that are now being used by Gauleiter Ardern? Nowhere. Nowhere to be seen. Silence except for the sound of crickets chirping. Where was the Human Rights Commission? More crickets. Where were the people opposing these excesses? Well, that's easy. cowering at home under quarantine when we didn't even quarantine new arrivals into the country. We quivered in fear and we lost our country. And I'm disgusted. Jacinda Ardern isn't a hero. She's a shabby little dictator with poor elocution, drunk on the power she gave herself. She's every bit the same and much, much worse than John Key. But don't worry, Lieblings. She will save us all from the next catastrophe, one she created to continue Goebbels' cycle of control. You see, they will be the ones who can save us from the economic disaster that has befallen us because of the original disaster, which, as you've been told, was that nasty virus. Can you see it now? Have I made the case? God defend New Zealand, because there is no one left to do that anymore. They keep saying that these are unprecedented times, but they're wrong. We've seen this all before. In Russia, the starving masses, destitute and war-weary, threw off the shackles of Imperial Russia and killed the Tsar, ushering in a new period of citizen control. The crisis was used to usurp, then replace the unfettered power of the Tsar with that of the Politburo and the Communist Party. Lenin gave way to Stalin, and brutality stalked their land for 70 years until Glasnost. The Iron Curtain fell, but not before millions died. In 1933, the Germans, shell-shocked from the dual pains of crushing reparations from World War I and the Great Depression, voted in a failed artist from Austria, who then used the democracy of the Weimar Republic to pervert, then subvert the rule of law to gain great power. Another series of crises were used to empower the ruling party. First the financial pressure of reparations, then the Depression, and then the appalling victimization of Jews, and finally a massive war that destroyed the country and millions of its citizens. And so here we are fighting another war, a silent virus that kills. Governments around the world subjugated their citizens, locked them down, told them to comply, and none more so than here. Jacinda Ardern, a woman who has never had a real job, used a crisis to wipe the failed history of her past 3 years. No one cares now that 100,000 houses or the train to the airport never materialised. No one sure as hell cares about child poverty anymore, and no one cares about climate change either. She saved us, and that's all that matters. But just like Germany in 1933, we're now going to have a depression, another crisis to milk. And just like 1933, we have an empowered police force that chose the government over the rule of law. And we've developed a snitch culture, ratting out the non-compliant. Next we will have the modern equivalent of a yellow star, called a contact tracing app. And it is all for our own good, don't we see? I can't wait until they sell us a ticket to a new state-provided housing development. Run along now, catch the Freedom Express. There's a New Zealand On Air funded band awaiting us at the station, and a nice hot shower to wash the travel weariness from our tired, downtrodden bodies. Work sets you free, remember? I'm Ken Slater, and this was Inside Politics. Thank you for listening.